All right, we are live, everybody. I am here with Alexander McCurse in London and Gonzalo Lira on the ground in somewhere. Somewhere. Gonzalo, first, Alexander, just a quick hello. How are you doing? And then let's pass it off to Gonzalo to hear how Gonzalo is. So, Alexander, real quick.
I'm doing very well. Obviously, the news is challenging to report. It's becoming very challenging to report for all kinds of reasons. But I mean, it's also war is never an easy thing to talk about. At least I don't. I've never found it easy. But in every other respect, I'm extremely well. And can I just say, I'm very grateful to all those people who were worrying about the fact that I was struggling to find baby milk. My wife and I, but we did sort it out. We've got plenty now, and we're well stocked. So thank you for your kind words. If you're all following, but that's problem is resolved.
All right. And Gonzalo Lira, first off, thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you on the live stream. And how are you, my friend? How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, and once again, it's a pleasure to be on with you both. And yeah, it's challenging because, as I've said repeatedly, being in this situation is at once incredibly tedious and boring, and terrifying at the same time. You know, because you're always a little bit stressed out. And I'm in the center of Kharkov. I've had some issues with potentially extremist people in the security forces of the current regime here in Ukraine who don't take kindly to some of the things I've said. And I've only ever tried to be as realistic and commonsensical as possible. But that is in short supply around the world, I would say. And I'm in the middle of Kharkov as it is being surrounded by the Russian army. And every day I can say that the sounds of shelling are getting closer. Which to me indicates that the Russians are tightening their noose around the city. And yeah, so let's dive into it wherever you guys want to start, and I'll tell you all that I know.
Well, let's go into it right away, Alexander Gonzalo. The topic of this live stream is the fourth negotiations that are taking place. So if you guys want to launch it from there, from the negotiations, we can start from there. Or if you guys want to give just a quick update as to how you see things unfolding, whether it's from geopolitical, economic, or on the ground, whatever you know from that standpoint as well. But right before we start, I just want to make one or two real quick announcements. First of all, hello to everybody watching us on Odyssey, Rumble, and Locals, as well as YouTube. Welcome everybody wherever you are in the world. Thank you to our moderators as well. A big thank you to our moderators. You guys are the best. And we are going to be doing a hard stop in about an hour and a half. So whatever questions that are thrown our way, whether they're from our locals community or from YouTube or Super Chats or Rumble, Odyssey, we will collect them all together again, and we will have a dedicated show, as we are doing now pretty much on a regular basis. We'll have a dedicated Q&A show where we will answer all of those questions. So we will do a hard stop in about an hour and a half. Alexander, Gonzalo, the floor is yours. Start from wherever you guys would like to start from. There's a lot of news to get to.
Yeah, I mean, let's just start with the negotiations, because I mean, I did a program about this yesterday, but I think one important thing to clarify at the moment is that we have negotiations, but that doesn't mean we're anywhere close to any sort of breakthrough. I think that some things have happened which suggest that the tilt in the negotiations is changing. We had the Israeli Prime Minister Bennett, who apparently, allegedly told Zelensky, look, you've got to sort out, you've got to be realistic. You've got to come and accept the Russian conditions, because sooner or later you're going to be forced to, so you might as well start negotiating seriously about that now. Now, that's been denied by the Israelis. It's been denied by the Ukrainians officially. It's all over the Israeli media. And I'm sure that Bennett did indeed tell Zelensky precisely that. And maybe the indication that there's been some movement over the last couple of days is that we've now learned that the negotiations, which are the negotiations which have been going on for several weeks, it's this group of negotiators from Ukraine, including the representative with the baseball cap and from Ukraine, very strange looking people, but anyway, I just mentioned that. But that negotiation with the Russians has been ongoing, And Lavrov, when he met the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba, made it absolutely clear in the press conference, and apparently to Kuleba's face, that that is the only venue for negotiations that the Russians are prepared to work with. They're not prepared to engage in any other parallel negotiation tracks. And from what I've been able to understand is that at the moment, the major focus in these negotiations, and one of the signs that something is happening, is that they've broken up into working groups. So there's people working out agreements on working groups. The major thing, the key point, is humanitarian corridors, local ceasefires to evacuate civilians from some of the key cities. And we've discussed in previous programs, all three of us, the way in which this very much resembles the strategy the Russians followed in Syria. And I noticed yesterday, or it might have been the day before yesterday, in the London Times, which, by the way, is the only major mainstream legacy media outlet in Britain that sometimes reports these kind of things, there was a Ukrainian official who actually also said that the Russians appear to be following the Syria-Aleppo process. So some work towards getting some kind of humanitarian corridor sorted out, some kind of local ceasefires, the eventual objective being to decant Ukrainian forces from all of these cities and to try to resolve the situation in them peacefully. That's the Russian objective, I'm sure of it. But I was also reading today, and I think it was in the Financial Times, that the Ukrainians are gradually moving towards some kind of slowly moving towards the Russian position on two of the issues that the Russians have flagged. One is demilitarization, the other is neutrality. We are very far from agreement on either of those points, but at least there's some sort of movement in that direction. I think that was in the Financial Times. Where there is no movement at all is on recognizing Crimea and Donbass, but that's probably the trickiest part of the negotiations going forward. So there's some sort of glacial movement on some of the political issues. On the humanitarian and ceasefire issues, it might happen more quickly. We shall see. The other thing is that the Ukrainians are again trying to set up some kind of summit meeting between Zelensky and Putin. I gather that the Russians are very cool on that idea. They don't want a meeting between Zelensky and Putin without some documents to sign, some real substantive documents to sign, specifically on the political issues. And I think they'd be very reluctant to have a meeting with Zelensky, which could just be used for grandstanding. So that's what I understand is the position in the negotiations. Some glacial movement on some of the political issues, some perhaps more substantive movement on local ceasefires and humanitarian corridors. I think, being realistic about it, this is going to take a long time before we see any real substantive breakthroughs. And, when I say a long time, I'm not going to say how long. It could be days, it could be weeks. I think more likely weeks than days.
Yeah, everything that you've said, Alexander, is exactly what I have heard, though my interpretation is not, I'm not taking any of this at face value, to tell you the truth. Because the whole point of humanitarian corridors is, of course, to evacuate civilians, but that's not the priority for the Russians. Their priority, insofar as humanitarian corridors are concerned, and the reason that Ukrainian forces, Zelensky regime forces, have blocked these humanitarian corridors is because they allow soldiers to take off their uniform, put down their weapon, and slip away with the civilians. And that is the reason that the Zelensky regime has been so adamantly against the humanitarian corridors. They keep insisting that the Russians only want to make corridors from the areas of conflict towards Russia or Belarus. This is not accurate. The Russians consistently offer escape routes for civilians and potentially fighters to Russia, to Belarus, and to the west of Ukraine and to the center of Ukraine, wherever the conflict is. So this is a Russian tactic, and of course, I did a video about this a few days ago. The Russians have no interest whatsoever in hurting people on these humanitarian corridors, because if they hurt people, if they start shelling these humanitarian corridors, what will happen is that people will be frightened of using them and won't use them. And of course, the Russians want people to use them to get rid of the civilians, in the sense of evacuating them from a conflict area, and therefore depriving the Zelensky regime of the PR value of dead civilians. And also, of course, the primary objective is to have soldiers begin to desert, which has always been a problem in every conflict. Now, my thinking is that the working groups are focusing on the humanitarian corridors, but I think that the Russians have no intention whatsoever of coming to any sort of agreement with these negotiations, because I think that they have made up their minds that their ultimate goal is complete control of Ukraine. And from their point of view, negotiations are great because they can work out these humanitarian corridors, and it makes them look as if they are doing something to end the hostilities, but they're not going to stop. I mean, even if Zelensky were to come at them and say, yes, you can have everything you want in these major points, the Russians would hem and haw, and because they want regime change. They want to get rid of the entire Zelensky regime. And politically, for Putin, he can't come to an agreement with the Zelensky regime because it would look like a loss. And here's the other fact that in the West, they are not reporting, and they're lying to themselves and to everybody else, which is the Russians are winning. They are clearly and decisively winning. And to claim that they're not is just, you're on a different planet. I'm here in Kharkov. I hear them getting closer every day. The noose is tightening in Kharkov every day. And you see this when you look at the maps of the other areas of great conflict. Mariupol, also the Eastern Army, Ukrainian army that has been essentially captured, because it's not clear at this time whether the Russians truly have them completely surrounded in the East. But what is known is that the roughly 50 to 60,000 strong army of Ukraine that is in Eastern Ukraine right now, near the contact line with the Donbass, they can't retreat because they don't have the resupply. They don't have the gasoline to move. And so they're kind of stuck, and they're certainly not going to get any reinforcements. And what seems to me to be happening is that the Russians have a coordinated offense where they have surrounded several nuclei of Zelensky regime forces. But the Zelensky regime forces do not have any kind of coordinated defense. It seems very clear, and you should bring on Scott Ritter, because he would be the man who would really be able to make clarity out of this. It seems that the various Zelensky regime units are isolated and essentially fending for themselves. And so I think that the notion that the Russians are losing is wishful thinking on the part of many people in the West. And also, I think it's a way to set up a false flag, because I do believe, with all the noise that has been coming out of Washington and Europe about the chemical weapons, and how the Russians are going to capture the material in the biolabs and then use them against the Ukrainians, which of course would prove that those biolabs had biological weapons, right? I mean, but anyway, it seems to me that the West is sort of like priming the pump for some sort of false flag operation, and say, see, the Russians were losing, and so that's why they went for these desperate means, and thereby opening the door to NATO involvement in this conflict. Because if you're looking at the facts on the ground, I don't quite understand how people think that they are losing when they are surrounding everything that's worth surrounding. And the stuff that they are ignoring, like the center of the country, well, the center of Ukraine doesn't have much except a lot of cows and grain, and so it seems the propaganda of Russia losing creates the conditions for a false flag by the West that can be easily blamed on Russia at this time. That seems to be the case.
Gonzalo, Gonzalo, can I just say, I as a masterly discussion, it is very difficult from London to get a clear picture of what's going on the ground. But to the extent that I can get it, and obviously I have to go to a variety of sources. I'm sorry, my dogs are barking rather loudly. But to the extent that I can get it from any sources, it is completely corroborating exactly what you are saying. That the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine are now essentially broken up into packets or parcels, that they're surrounded, and that they're finding it extremely difficult to coordinate, and that they're no longer able to engage in any kind of maneuvers or offensive operations. And that in the most difficult place, which is Mariupol, apparently, again, as you rightly say, the Russians are gradually, steadily edging ever closer to the center of the city. And I've heard that, it'll be days before it finally falls. And of course, Mariupol is an important place because apparently, I'm not a military person, but apparently it's something of a hinge in the battlefield. Can I just talk about this business about biological, chemical attacks and all this? Because it's absolutely clear to me here that there is a split between the State Department, which has been very heavily promoting all of these stories and which is clearly taking the initiative in taking an extremely hard line against the Russians on almost every topic. They're the people who come up with all of the various sanctions ideas, who floated. I personally think that crazy MiG-29 idea from Poland was basically hatched there. That's my own personal view. Anyway, the State Department seems to be taking these very hardline positions. The Pentagon is spending its time shooting them down, like it's shot down the MiG-29 idea, for example. And then over the weekend, and again, I've been reading so many things in so many places. I don't remember where I read it, but I read that the Pentagon has actually said that they see no evidence of any preparation from any party, including the Russians, for any kind of biochemical incident in Ukraine. So I think the reason the Pentagon is saying that is because they figured out exactly, Gonzalo, what you're saying, which is that any attempt to stage an incident of this kind is clearly an attempt to put pressure on the Pentagon to, declare no-fly zones, intervene in some way, and they don't want to do that. They're absolutely adamantly against this. And of course, they've opened up the deconfliction hotline. So they're talking. This is a thing people don't perhaps realize. The US military is talking with the Russian military in Ukraine constantly. There is constant movement backward and forward, messages, communications, that sort of thing going on. So I find myself somewhat stunned to be saying this, but the Pentagon is acting as a tremendous sheet anchor of sanity in this crazy situation. That's how it looks to me.
That I would agree with you completely, and I think what must have spooked the Pentagon especially was the cruise missile attack on the NATO training center in western Ukraine. It's a town just west of Lviv, about 20 miles from the border with Poland, and it's a place where NATO had previously had teachers, military, of course, teaching NATO tactics to Ukrainian armed forces before this present conflict. And it was the place where a great many of the mercenaries or military volunteers, call them what you will, who had gone to Ukraine, that was their staging area. And the word is that they were hit with 30 cruise missiles in one go, and the entire place was lit up. And the number of dead that the Ukrainians admitted to 35 dead, 135 wounded. And the Russians said, no, it's closer to 200. And slowly the Ukrainian number is starting to creep up towards that 200 that the Russians are claiming. And by the way, how did the Russians know that it was 200? And that probably means that the Russians have exceptionally good intel within the Ukrainian armed forces. But that's for another conversation. The point here, I think that attack must have spooked the Pentagon very badly, because the Ukrainians didn't see it coming, and nobody saw it coming, and it just happened. It just leveled the whole place. The name slips my mind. If Alex, you can find the name of the place, but I think that we all know what I'm talking about.
Yarovsky,
Yeah, Yarovsky.
Yaroviv, or something like that. Yeah,
Yeah, and
Yarovsky,
actually,
training facility.
I passed that town. I've mentioned before in other opportunities that I rode my motorcycle across all of Ukraine from the Polish border, and right there, all the way, to Lviv and on to Kiev and all the rest of it. And so I passed that town. It's right next door to Poland. And so I think it must have scared the Pentagon something badly. The thought that potentially one of these cruise missiles might have fallen into Poland, and God knows what the political implications of that would be. And also, it scared off all of these military volunteers, if you want to call them that, because a lot of them were supposed to be going to Ukraine to join in the fight. And the Russians said very clearly that any weapons coming from the West, any soldiers coming from the West would be considered fair game. They said that, I think, on Friday. It wasn't Peskov. It was a spokesperson for the Ministry of Defense of Russia. And they said that on Friday. On Sunday, bright and early in the morning, before dawn, they are leveling that whole staging area. And obviously making it clear that they are not focused on Western Ukraine yet, but they can do whatever they want in Western Ukraine. And there isn't anything that anybody can do about it, either the Ukrainian armed forces or NATO. And I think that in combination is just scaring off the Pentagon, and they want no part of this. I think that the Pentagon is realistic and realizing the things that ought to be obvious to any thinking person. Number one, the Russians have their military right there, okay? And they still have held back some of their best men, their best pilots, their best planes, their best tanks. They still have plenty of gas in the tank, as it were. And they're right in their doorstep. And number two, for them, it's existential. They are going to win this no matter what it takes. They are not going to, because it's not like Afghanistan. It's not like some foreign adventure. This is right there in their doorstep. And I think that the people at the Pentagon, like you correctly said, Alexander, are putting the brakes on any kind of insanity coming out of the State Department.
Yeah, the town is Yavoriv. I'm seeing from the chat. Okay, so that's the town.
Yep.
A couple of quick comments. The other thing that you left out, Gonzalo, is that Stoltenberg made comments saying that if the Russians dare to touch one bullet, one gun of NATO property, then it is going to lead to an Article 5 incident. And what was the Russians' response? They took out this training facility. So exactly. In a way, they kind of called Stoltenberg's bluff there. A couple of other things real quick. Maybe a question to both of you guys. If Putin were to take that meeting with Zelensky, doesn't that legitimize Zelensky and his shenanigans all this time? I mean, in a way, it would be a diplomatic loss for Russia. So he really can't take that meeting with Zelensky until they have something concrete in place, because it kind of legitimizes everything that Zelensky has been saying the past 2 weeks. And it also provides the U.S. with a talking point, the collective West, let's say. It provides them with that talking point that Wendy Sherman was discussing, I believe, like 2-3 days ago, where she said that Putin is starting to come around because the Russian military is losing so badly. So it kind of supports that talking point, and they'll be able to spin it in a way that will be okay, because Russia was losing so badly, it actually forced Putin to come to the negotiating table with Zelensky. So, I mean, what I want to say is that there's really not much choice for Russia or for Putin to meet with Zelensky either way, because it'll be seen as a diplomatic and a strategic loss. I mean, what do you guys think about that? And then I think we should also talk about the incident with China and Jake Sullivan pushing out over the weekend that Russia is seeking aid from China. And we've gotten very strong rebuttals from both China and Russia.
Well, can I just say a few things? A few things here. Can I just go back though to a point that Gonzalo made before, which was about what the Russian objectives are. The Scholz and Macron had a conversation with Putin just a few days ago, about 2 days ago, and afterwards, the French were putting out information which is exactly in line with what you said, Gonzalo, that they see that the Russians remain completely implacable, that they're not interested in the kind of ceasefire that the Western powers are trying to engineer. And the French were putting it out that the ultimate objective is the whole of Ukraine. That's what the French are saying. I mean, I don't know whether it's true or not, but that was what was all over the media here in Britain. I cannot overstate how dismayed the media in Britain was after this missile strike in Western Ukraine.
Really?
You know, it was, you know, the big news. There was serious alarm about this here in London. You could sense this if you read the newspapers properly. And so much so that I do indeed wonder what it was exactly which happened. I think that we're probably going to discover at some point, maybe in a year or two, that there's a lot more to this incident than we know. And that I don't want to say too much because obviously we're on a particular platform. But I did notice that there was a rushed statement that no NATO personnel were involved. So
oh no, I have no doubt. I personally, you gentlemen are far more judicious than I am, and you know that I'm willing to speculate freely and randomly, and often stupidly. But I would venture to guess that that NATO had some people there, and that NATO might have lost some people, and of course, you know, they can't admit to having NATO people there for obvious political reasons, and because it would prove, of course, the Russians' point. And so, I think that in a few years, once this is all over, one way or the other, and frankly, I only see it ending one way, which is complete Russian victory, because they're there. they're like 3/4 of the way there. So so I'm positive that there were NATO people, and I think also it must have scared them because of the decisiveness. Because people in the West are very used to bluster and talk, but little action, and certainly not that kind of decisive action, surprising and seemingly spontaneous action that Putin seems to be a real master of. I mean, if we go back 2 weeks, the invasion of itself, and I freely admit, I never thought that an invasion would happen. But that decisiveness and the going for brokeness, if that's an adjective, of how the Russians went about the invasion, you know, that shocks people. And I think that this attack shocked a lot of people, a lot of military people. And that surprise from the military people must have been translated to the journalists that you read.
Absolutely. And can I say that in some ways, the very fact that there was this shock does beg a lot of questions, because, of course, the Russians have been launching attacks on air bases and airfields and military bases all over Ukraine. Why would there be so much particular shock about an attack on this particular base? All right, it's very close to the Polish border, but the Russians have never said that they were going to attack, that they were going to limit their attacks to one part of Ukraine as opposed to another. So why was there the shock, and why was the casualty rate so high? I think that there must have been, as I said, there's a story here that we don't know. And of course, it may be that they're not people, NATO people, exactly at this airbase, but of course you can have all kinds of contractors and subcontractors and subcontractors who come from all kinds of countries, and they might have been there. They might have been doing all kinds of things. We're not going to learn more about this for a while, but certainly you have to be familiar with the way the British media works to realize what big news this was. And as I said, it really has unsettled people here.
Well, is that the action? Is that the action, guys, of a side that's losing? That's that is that the action of a side that's in disarray, that's disorganized? What the Russian military did in that training facility? I mean, I look at that, and that is not the action of a military that has felt like it's lost this war. I think it's the exact opposite.
Yeah. It sounds to me like the actions of a military that can decide, oh, well, you guys are trying to slip weapons here in Poland. Okay, look at what I do. And just moves a rook hard across the table and just slams it on the table and says, what are you going to do about them apples? You know, I mean, that was the feeling I got, and a clear indication that there's no place in Ukraine where NATO weapons or potentially personnel can be hidden from them. And I think that might have been it, that notion that, you know, these guys can really, yeah. So, I mean, that's the vibe I get. And but I'm really curious, Alexander, about if you don't mind my asking, what was it? What's the vibe? I mean, I don't want to. I want to invite you to speculate a little bit as to, you know, or sort of like expand a little bit out on the vibe, on the feeling that you are perceiving from these newspaper accounts. Because I agree with you. Many times these newspaper accounts, when something is expected, they're just like, this was expected. But I want to know what the tinge of the surprise was. Was it shock? Was it just complete surprise? Was it dismay, as if some operation that was ongoing was suddenly collapsed? Please.
Shock, dismay, astonishment that it should have happened there, all of which, as I said, begs important questions and does make one wonder why they assumed that this particular location would not be attacked. That is one. I think the other thing that has caused a shock, and, you know, bear in mind, we've had a huge amount of information, in inverted commas here, about the way in which the Russians conduct this war. The other great shock was the precision of this attack. These are very, very long-range missiles launched from enormous distances. We don't obviously know how great the distances were, but they hit exactly on target. And that isn't something, as I said, which makes people here in London very comfortable, because it does show, firstly, you're absolutely right, it shows that the Russians know exactly what's going on in this place, know exactly what to hit, and they can hit it, and they can hit it directly on the place that it needs to be hit at. So, as I said, this was perhaps the single military event that has created the biggest dismay. And it was very interesting that when you looked at the media in Britain, the actual officials, government ministers, people like that, were completely silent about it. That, you know, you don't have anything from Johnson, from Liz Truss, from Ben Wallace, from anybody like that, actually specifically addressing what actually happened in this incident. You got instead all the usual commentators, analysts, inverted commas, analysts. You got people like that talking about it. So official silence, big headlines, dismay, playing up of the warnings from the US that, you know, if there's an attack on an inch of NATO territory, there will be a massive response. Well, of course, this isn't what happened. And as I said, it does suggest something very big happened, and big in ways that, you know, we don't fully understand.
Because I'm wondering if the Russians decided to make this move as basically just booping NATO on the nose and saying, stay out of here. You know, kind of like when you boop the nose of a dog with a rolled up newspaper, just to teach them a lesson. And they're sort of like, oh, okay, we're not really going to mess with you. We'll talk a lot, but we're not really going to mess with you. I mean, from the point of view of the Russians, they want to scare NATO enough that NATO decides, no, we don't want to mess with these guys. And so, but let's move on to the Chinese issue, which I think is really fascinating.
Chinese, go ahead, Gonzalo. China, Jake Sullivan's comments. Military aid. You know, Putin's asking for military aid from China. What do you make of it?
Once again, okay, first of all, that notion that Russia has to ask China for military aid, it's laughable. I mean, it's just laughable. Okay, because first of all, the Russians are armed. They've got plenty of gear of their own. I mean, if they ever asked the Chinese, it would be like, you know, spare parts or something trivial like that, not like a real, like, oh, we need a couple of divisions, or we need like a squadron of aircraft. No, it would be trivial if the enormous if they would even bother to ask, because the Russians are prepared. They've got gear. So that, I think, was just an outright lie formulated by the West to, again, give this illusion that Russia's on the back foot in this war, which, again, is absurd. I think that Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor of the United States, is trying to play 4D chess, but he's only got a 1D mind. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean, because he's trying to wrist wrestle the Chinese into backing the American position, and the Chinese aren't having none of it. Because the Chinese had made up their mind years ago, and one could venture perhaps decades ago, that Russia is their future. And so they have no interest or intention whatsoever on turning their back on that relationship, which the Chinese have invested so much time and effort in. It doesn't make any sense. And the notion that they're going to, the Chinese are not liking this whole thing, that Chinese firms are going to be punished if they continue to do business with Russia. And that could be the cleavage point. And I think that Jake Sullivan is trying to push that, trying to get China on side. And he has this bizarre illusion, as so many people in Foggy Bottom seem to have, that they can see daylight between China and Russia. There is no daylight between those two countries. There hasn't been in years. And so any notion that you can cleave those two together, stick a wedge between them, and somehow pry them apart is laughable. When push comes to shove, the Chinese are going to go with the Russians every time.
Gonzalo, you said it perfectly. I mean, I've got little to add, just a few things. First of all, if we're talking about spare parts and things of that kind, the Chinese military, its equipment is completely different from the Russian. I mean, the day when, the Chinese military used old Soviet equipment, I mean, that's, 40, 50 years ago. I mean, it just doesn't apply anymore. And the kind of equipment we're talking about, the Russians themselves don't use anymore. So, I mean, there's no conceivable way in which, the Russians could borrow weapons from the Chinese and use them against the Ukrainians. And I mean, there's just isn't that degree of interoperability. They're completely different military forces. Maybe in future things will change, but at the moment that just isn't the case at all. Secondly, Sullivan is due to meet Yang Jiechi, who is Xi Jinping's chief foreign policy advisor in Rome in a few days. The Chinese have just confirmed this, by the way. And this is, I think, exactly what Gonzalo was saying. It's an attempt to try to create some kind of wedge between the Chinese and the Russians, to have, the Chinese come out and say, well, no, we're not providing any kind of help to the Russians, and create difficulties between these two countries. This is absolutely stupid. I mean, it's adolescent diplomacy, because of course the Russians and the Chinese are in constant contact. I just was looking just a few minutes ago, before we started this program, I was looking at the Chinese Foreign Ministry website. And sure enough, I see that, for example, a Chinese senior diplomat, just spoke with another senior Russian diplomat. They were talking about the Iran deal, all kinds of things like that. The Russians and the Chinese are in constant communication. And there is no conceivable way in which the US is going to be able to play the Chinese off against the Russians, or get the Chinese to exercise restraints against the Russians. Now, as for this idea of the US imposing sanctions on Chinese companies that, deal with Russia, I'm going to say two things. If this is done on any extensive scale, then of course we are looking at an economic crisis in the West that, just doesn't bear contemplation. I mean, we're already looking at a crisis because of the way in which the oil prices have spiked, and all kinds of things have been happening on that front. But if you start disrupting Chinese supply chains at this particular moment in that kind of way, Well, I mean, I mean, we're not looking at 20% inflation. We're looking at 40% inflation.
No, it's
I mean,
curtains for the West.
plucking
Curtains
figures out of the sky. I mean, it is a ludicrous bluff. The second is that, having been to China, I don't think people like Sullivan understand the sheer mass of this economy. There will always be businesses in China which do all kinds of things, cover every kind of activity that you can think of, but are not focused on the West. And sanctions aren't going to affect them. So you'll always find some people who will provide, the textiles, the clothes, all the kind of things that, are the paint. I saw that there was an attempt to stop a Dutch company providing paint to the Russians. There's always going to be some companies in China that will do that. Sure. And with Russian banks now increasingly operating within the RMB, the Chinese currency system, something which must clearly have been organized in advance, that's actually going to be profitable to many Chinese companies. And at the end of the day, because they don't trade with the West, it's not going to be an issue for them. We have this idea that, China is just one giant export machine, just as we think of Russia as one giant gas station. And
hateful phrase.
Yes, I know, it is an awful phrase. And again, it's I mean, that might have been true in 1996, but it simply isn't the case anymore. It's based on an obsolete way of thinking. What I'm predicting.
And I would also. I'm sorry. I just want to add something too. That the Chinese and Russian cooperation is so extensive that they have gone on joint patrols in East Asia, let alone joint military exercises. But I've always thought that the joint patrols were actually more important because that's more quotidian. That's more like a day-to-day kind of rubbing of shoulders between Russian officer corps and Chinese officer corps. And so I have no doubt in my mind that the Chinese are the best appraised people on the face of the planet insofar as actual Russian advances in this current conflict. I have no doubt in my mind that the Russians are making it a point to give the Chinese a clear picture militarily, warts and all, including their failures, precisely so as to build more trust with the Chinese, because that's been the consistent strategy of Putin and his group, that they identify certain relationships or certain communications channels that they are meticulous in being very honest and forthright. For instance, like the current conflict, we have the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that consistently tell people what's going on. They don't try to, they don't invent the ghost of Kiev or the 13 martyrs of Snake Island or any nonsense like this, which later turns out to be PR nonsense, right? And that kind of consistent building of credibility is very valuable at key moments. The Chinese must be perfectly aware of how things are going militarily. And that, of course, by knowing such granular detail, it will make the Chinese even harder to split apart from the Russians, because the Chinese know exactly how the Russians are doing. And so there's no uncertainty, because lack of trust comes from uncertainty. But if you know exactly how your partner is doing in some conflict or some other situation peripheral to your relationship with him, then that trust becomes stronger. And this is human nature. And so I think that this whole Jake Sullivan play of trying to split China from the Russians is ludicrous. I think that, of course, the notion of actually sanctioning China is just stupid. I mean, even floating the idea is just dumb, because it hurts your economy, it scares people. And I think we are seeing this with India being threatened by sanctions for doing business with the Russians. And now this was announced, I do believe today, the Indians and the Russians are working out a mechanism for the Indians to buy Russian oil in rupees. They're working out a mechanism for a rupee-ruble exchange rate. And they're going to tie it in somehow with the renminbi, the currency of China. Apparently they want to use the renminbi as a standard, potentially ushering in ushering the day that the renminbi might become the global reserve currency or another one of the global reserve currencies. But that's for a different conversation. The fact that the Indians and the Russians are doing this, and what's interesting is that the Russians are going to sell oil at a discount to the Indians. It's basically signaling, hey, if you are on our enemies list, no oil for you, no food for you, and no fertilizer for you, which is a big deal because Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine produce a pivotal amount of the exportable grain around the world. I believe 25% of the global export market in wheat, and they are a pivotal player in the fertilizer industry, which is crucial now because now in the next 4 months we're going to have the planting season, and this will affect food prices come the fall, winter. And so this deal that the Russians are making with the Indians and figuring out a way to exchange via rubles and rupees will ultimately lead people to say, hey, we should just trade directly with the Russians, cut out the dollar, ignore treasury bonds, move into the ruble, move into the renminbi, and work with these guys, the Chinese and the Russians, like the Indians are doing, and we'll get a discount. The Russians are playing this game very well. And so it seems to me that, yeah, they might be taking a hit right now, but in 4 to 8 months from now, they might be looking really, really good, in really good shape, whereas the West is going to be looking at double-digit inflation for sure.
Alexander, unmute. Expand on.
Yeah. I find myself in complete agreement with Gonzalo. This is, but
great minds think alike.
Great minds think alike. Double-digit inflation, I am sure we, to all intents and purposes, already have. I mean, yes. I can see this now manifesting itself increasingly in London. And obviously, London is more exposed than the US is, but I'm sure that that's coming. And one of the most grotesque things that I've seen with this inflation thing is that now Biden is trying to blame the whole inflation crisis, all of it, every part of it, on Putin. It's nothing to do with him. It's Putin who's to blame for the inflation crisis. Now, this is getting much worse.
Bastard.
I know. I mean, this is going to get much worse over the next few weeks and months. But you're absolutely right. The big underlying story here is that there is a new financial system now being created at an accelerated pace, and India is involved. And as a parenthesis, it was very interesting that the Indians and the Chinese, who are supposed to be at odds with each other, had a very productive meeting talking about border issues. And it seems that they reached a lot of agreement on de-escalation and deconfliction.
Oh, really? I hadn't heard
absolutely.
That. Could you expand on that?
It's completely unreported in the West. Both the Chinese and the media. Absolutely, it is serious. Exactly. Now, we obviously there's been meetings like that in the past, which seem to have gone well, and then things have gone wrong, and all that kind of thing. But at the moment, the Indians and the Chinese seem to be intent on working together. I think that they are all seeing this administration in Washington. They don't like it.
No.
They don't like the way it's handled this Ukraine situation. They don't like the people who, the people like Sullivan and Blinken, and they're making their own decisions. And just, if you remember a few days ago, about a week ago, there was a lot of excitement because an official at the UAE said that the UAE might do something in mumbled words about, UAE might try to persuade OPEC to increase oil supplies. Mm-hmm. They've done absolutely nothing.
Oh yeah,
nothing has happened since. Yeah. They're still not accepting Biden's calls. And I understand that the foreign minister of Qatar is on the way to Moscow. So, it's not looking.
Well, it seems to me that this crisis might be the catalyst that frees up the possibility of strong ties between India and China. Because I agree with you. Nobody likes the American administration, but I think it's more subtle than that. They're scared of the American administration in the sense that they are unpredictable in an incompetent way, that they do stupid things. Because the Russians, for instance, and the Chinese, they didn't have that much of a problem with Trump because he was unpredictable, but in a very rational way, in a crafty way. And so they were like, yeah, he's an SOB and all the rest of it, but he's our kind of SOB. We understand that kind of shiftiness, whereas the current administration is just incompetent. And of course, because Biden himself personally is so weak, what you really have going is a bunch of different factions behind the scenes that are pulling the administration in different directions, often contradictory directions, that can be very, very damaging to different countries. The hysteria over Russia is a prime example. It just went overboard. And so I think that because of this crisis, because of the absurd anti-Russian sanctions and xenophobia and hysteria and all the rest of it, the Indians are saying, it's not smart to hitch our wagon to the Americans. Let's make nice with the Chinese. And the Chinese, who are clever, if anything, they're realizing, the border issues that we have with the Indians, why don't we do like we did with the Russians in the 90s? Because if you recall, in the 90s, the Chinese, before the 90s, the Chinese and the Russians had constant border disputes. And in the 90s, the Chinese made a consistent effort to solve those problems, precisely so as to lay the groundwork for improved relations with Russia, which now are obviously paying enormous dividends to the Chinese and sort of in terms of access to raw materials, access to military technologies and other high-tech technologies that the Russians have developed. So I think that they might be making the same calculation insofar as India. And this, to finish the point I want to make and the conclusion that I think is important, this would be a pivot on the part of India, the India-China relationship, because India and Russia have always been steady. If it pivots this India-China relationship, all of a sudden you have three very large players. I mean, two of the largest countries on the planet, and the third, the physically largest country on the planet, all of a sudden dancing to the same tune, dancing together. And this will naturally create a gravitational attraction that will bring in Iran. And clearly, by the way, it's the Russians that are sabotaging the Iran deal, and the Iranians are going along with it because they value their relationship with the Russians. It would bring in Iran. It would bring in other countries, Vietnam, which has had longstanding problems with China. I mean, it would make a huge pivot on the geopolitical level and really marginalize Western Europe and the United States after 4 or 5 centuries of dominance in world political affairs. Am I talking out of my butt, or does this make sense to you guys?
You're not talking out of your butt at all. You're talking exactly right. And by the way, there was a very, very good article by Martin Jakes, a British academic who actually works in China, who makes some of the same points. I mean, the point he's making is that Sullivan, Blinken, all of these people, Boris Johnson in Britain, they're still living in the world of 20, 30 years ago, where, the world economy was essentially the West's economy. I mean, the US decided everything. And, this even was true during the Cold War. I mean, there was the Soviet Union in its bloc, but relatively speaking, it was very small. Everywhere else you were, in India, in Japan, in Africa, in Latin America, everything was structured around the West and the Western economies, which were overwhelmingly dominant. That world has gone and it's receding. The real center of economic gravity is the Indo-Pacific region. And China, obviously, India to a great extent, the ASEAN countries as well. It's simply these statements, that we're going to start sanctioning Chinese companies if they do trade with Russia and that kind of thing, is based on a misunderstanding of the world, of the economic balance of the world, based upon history rather than contemporary fact. And if you go to Asia, I mean, which I have done, I mean, for example, Union Pay there, the Union Pay cards, which are completely outside the American, financial system, the Western financial system, they are everywhere. They are more widely accepted in places like Malaysia, for example, than Visa or MasterCard are. In fact, which is just said, I think many people in the West simply just can't get their minds around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
the Middle East is also going to pivot, guys.
Yeah.
I mean, we got 3 more years of Biden. 3 more years. I think the Middle East is going to pivot. Saudi Arabia, MBS absolutely despises Biden. They're not picking up his calls. Africa is already pivoted. I think. Take a look at how Kenya voted in the UN Security Council. I mean, that's just look at what's going on in Africa. We already know that China has a huge presence in Africa, and to me, this is all about trust. The Biden White House and the EU, they destroyed all the trust in the Western financial architecture. It's gone. They destroyed it.
Yeah.
And it's not going to come back. And they did it so fast, it's not going to come back. And it goes back to a point that we were talking about, Alexander, in a live that we did maybe about a week ago, which is the fact that the EU and the US, they vomited all their sanctions and all their cards. They threw them right on the table, and they just threw everything out there in this hysterical, emotional hissy fit. They didn't hold anything back. No. And then you take a look at what Russia is doing, and they haven't retaliated at all, pretty much. No. Even the talk about nationalizing assets, I'm hearing a lot of discussion from different parts of the Russian elite class and the Kremlin. Some people are saying nationalize those assets, but a lot of people are saying don't do it because it may sound nice, but if we do nationalize assets of companies that have just put a pause, have not left Russia, but have just put a pause in doing business, we're going to break that trust that investors have with our country. So you're hearing debate. I mean, people are talking about it before they do it. It seemed like the Blinkens and the Sullivans and the van der Leyens and the Borrells were just like, you know what, Putin bad, Russia bad, sanction the central bank, confiscate everything.
Yeah,
and it was done.
I don't think that people in the United States, certainly, or even in Western Europe, understand how shocking it is to have confiscated all your foreign currency reserves and that you've deposited in the United States and Western banks. This is shocking. I mean, they just went ahead and stole it. This is asset forfeiture. It is a practice that in the United States is quite common, and it's highly destructive. It's basically law enforcement says, oh, we think you're guilty of a crime, so we're going to take your stuff, your money, your car, your house, even in some cases. It's really a despicable.
Can you say Abramovich? Can you say Abramovich?
Yeah, well, it doesn't really matter if you like these oligarchs or not. That's not the point. The point is the central bank hitting them in their reserves. I mean, that would, if I'm an asset manager at a central bank, I'm scared. I'm all of a sudden thinking, if my government just does something that the Americans don't like, are they going to steal my money too? The money that I'm responsible for, the money of my country? I'd be scared. And the Americans don't seem to realize how this policy it's going to be viewed retrospectively as one of the most traumatic things ever in financial period of this time, because so many other central banks are looking at this horrified. And they're thinking, how do we get out of America without anybody noticing? And that is the key issue, because see, if a lot of these asset managers, I mean, the three of us, we have, we have a little bit of sophistication in these kinds of things. So we know how these guys think. They're not going to make a trigger happy decision. They're going to take their time, but they're going to slowly edge their way to the door insofar as holding on to dollar assets. If I'm an asset manager, I'm getting out of the dollar. I'm getting out of all treasuries, but I'm not going to do it in a way that is that people notice it. I'm just going to slowly start, not going to the 2-year auctions, slowly divesting myself and swapping it out. Lots of swaps are going to start happening, asset swaps, whereby it's a trading situation where you have a particular asset and I'm explaining to the listeners, you as an asset manager, you have some particular asset and you want to get out of it, but you don't really want cash. And so you go to a counterparty and say, I've got, 30-year treasury bonds, maturing in 2045. Give me, Chinese bonds, or give me the bonds of a commodities rich country like Chile, for instance. Give me Chilean bonds, which are rock solid because of the commodities. And you swap out your positions. And it's actually very difficult for the Federal Reserve to realize when Treasury bonds are being swapped out, because it's not a sale. They're just swapping it. And because of that, the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, excuse me, and the Treasury Department for that matter, they know that they have Treasury bonds outside of the United States in sovereign wealth funds, but they don't know really who holds them because it's self-reporting. And so a lot of, this is a supposition on my part. I come from a banking background, so this is kind of like stuff that I know, I grew up with, I'm guessing that a lot of fund managers have exited their positions or are in the process of planning how to exit their positions by way of swaps so as to make it as quiet as possible. I don't know if this was too obscure for the audience, but it's very important because it'll mean that there will be more and more weakness in the dollar, more and more inflation because of people exiting the dollar and getting into other asset classes.
Absolutely. Now, can I just say something? I think the other thing that's been propping up the dollar over the last 10 years, 10, 15 years, is that up to now, there hasn't been that alternative safe haven. So people have been increasingly, I think, uneasy about the things that the United States has been doing politically. They've also been increasingly uneasy about many of its economic policies, but the dollar is still there. It's still the world's reserve currency. It's still the currency that's used for trading in goods and commodities. So at the end of the day, you have no real option but to put your money in dollars. And that's been the thing that's kept the dollar up, there. What they've just done is going to make it much more likely that before very long, we are going to start seeing safe haven alternatives. Chinese currency be used as the anchor for rupee trades.
Yeah,
It's an alternative system of financial architecture being established in which you don't have to put your money in dollars anymore in order to find a safe asset. And if that crystallizes over the next, it'd still take a few years, I think, to fully crystallize. But if it crystallizes, then to be straightforward about this, especially if this administration continues along the path which is going, which of course it will, because it knows no other, then I can very easily see an implosion. And this is something that I think people in the US need to understand. Whereas an implosion, not a collapse. There will always be value for the dollar because, of course, it's a huge economy still and all that. But an implosion of the dollar's position as the world's reserve currency, it will certainly and dramatically shift. And at that point, of course, the United States will be faced for the first time with the challenge of having to decide how it's going to live within its means, because that's what the US hasn't been doing for at least 30 years now, at least certainly since the end of the Clinton era.
And I would also, I would venture to speculate something, and this is just throwing it out there. I would think that the currencies that people are going to start to get into are the currencies of commodities-rich countries. The Russian ruble, the Chilean peso, the Canadian dollar, of all things, the Australian dollar. See, the countries that have commodities that have, and not just a few commodities, but industrial metals, food production, I think is going to be a big deal. Something that 3 years ago you'd be laughed out of the room if you said that there was going to be food insecurity and that agricultural commodities were going to be a big player. Well, they're looking like they're going to be a very big player this year because of the fertilizer issue and the fact that Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine control, such a huge market in the agro-commodities. I'm guessing that the currency of the future, the currencies of the future, will be the countries that have large commodity positions, export commodity positions. Wow, this is fun. This is going to be really cool.
I entirely agree. Anyway, I mean, the point is, I don't think this administration understands any of this. I think that I think it was you who said some time ago, Gonzalo, in a previous live stream that we did, that they still live and function within this architecture that has existed for so long, and which has always been up to now so stable. They cannot contemplate a reality beyond this.
What happens next, guys? Where do we go from
Alexander?
here? What does the U.S. have to do? What does the EU have to do? Can they tell Zelensky to surrender and to walk everything back? Can they roll some of these sanctions back, or is it a one way street? What about Russia? What about Russia? What do they do? Is it a one way street for them? They have to win. Can they negotiate a settlement?
I think the Germans and the French, but especially the Germans, this is my sense from Germany, are starting to get vertigo about what they've done. I think they're beginning to understand that some of these ideas, about phasing out Russian oil and Russian coal and Russian gas and all that within a year is simply not practical, and that the hit that Germany stands to suffer from all of this is enormous, and not just a short-term hit, but a long-term one as well. As I've said many times, we have a very weak, very inexperienced German government, which just didn't understand what it was doing. And I think they expected that announcing this massive shock and awe sanctions would provoke a political and financial crisis in Russia. The banking system would collapse there. The oligarchs would move. Putin would be overthrown. And it hasn't happened. So what they're trying to do at the moment, the French and the Germans, because this is the weakness of the French, Macron cannot ever bring himself to break with the Germans. He could have done it. He'd done it a few weeks ago. That was his opportunity. That was his moment to shine. He balked. He just couldn't bring himself conceptually to break with the Germans. But what I think they're trying to do is they're trying to get the Russians to stop. They want to try and get the Russians. They're talking all the time to the Russians. Let's have this ceasefire. And what's happening is the Russians are coming back and they are saying, no, we are not interested in a ceasefire at the moment. We are going to see this operation completed. Gonzalo, at an earlier point in this live stream, you said we're going to continue. We're going to continue it no matter what.
Yeah.
And if you actually go to one of the Kremlin readouts, I think it was with Macron, Putin used those very same words to Macron, according to
again, great minds think alike.
Matter what, exactly. So I think the Germans and the French are becoming increasingly nervous and increasingly stressed about this. I think that they've also grasped that financial sanctions simply cannot go further without causing real damage. Well, obviously, there's already been enormous damage, but potentially exponential damage to the European economy. So I think they've maxed out on the financial sanctions. I think the energy sanctions, I think they're beginning to understand that even if they were to succeed in this hopeless endeavor of stopping Russian oil imports and coal imports and even eventually gas imports, there is a world market in coal, gas and oil. And if you cut out Russian oil, gas and coal, that will leave you with structurally higher energy prices, which will translate into structurally higher inflation. And of course, if you know anything about Germany, you know that the entire country is designed to work in a low inflation situation. So I think the Germans and the French have a sense of vertigo at the moment, because they're still caught up in the hysteria of the hour, the hysteria of this month of March, which we're only halfway through, by the way. They can't turn around and start reversing some of the things they've done. So they still have to keep pushing. The only thing they can do is come back and repeatedly ask Putin for this ceasefire. But eventually, and I think over time, we are going to start to see some kind of a pullback. And it's noticeable that already there's been splits between the Americans and the Europeans over oil, that the Americans imposed this embargo on themselves, the Europeans didn't. So we're going to start to see, I predict, sometime in the autumn, so late summer, autumn, once this military operation in Ukraine has achieved its objectives, we're going to start to see people coming up, trying to put some of the pieces together again. I think that's probably where we're going to end up. So sometime around the autumn, we'll start to see the dialogues resume. Perhaps some of these companies that pulled out tentatively trying to get back in, some of the linkages being restored. That's my feeling. And by the way, interestingly enough, there's also been some articles in some of the British media that have been talking about this as well, that, we've got to try, after all this is over, try to find some way to repair some of this damage. We will never be able to repair all of it. And the thing that I've come to realize, and it's deeply troubled me, is that this sort of wave of anger towards Russia has been clearly building up for years, and it goes much further and much deeper amongst much larger sections of the European population than I had ever realized. I mean, I'm baffled by it. I don't completely understand it, but it's welled up in this extraordinary way. And I think that the Russians, for their part, have seen it. And I think that they're going to make the decision now that after this, there's never any going back. There's no going back to Europe in the way that there was. From now on, it's ourselves alone with our friends in the East. The days of Russia thinking of itself, conceiving as itself as part of Europe are ended, and ended forever.
I agree. And this is my thinking. See, several facts come to mind. Number one, these sanctions and the anti-Russian hysteria have strengthened Putin's hand domestically. Okay, and you can say that, it's state-run polling data, but the general sense is that people are behind Putin. You don't need a polling station to tell you that they are behind Putin. So it strengthens his hand. And I think that the Russians are going to realize, we don't actually need Europe. They cut us off. The Europeans and the Americans cut us off. And how are we doing? Yeah, we took a hit, but we're still standing. And see, this is the thing. A lot of times people are more afraid of the hit. And so they will do a lot of things to avoid the hit. But when they finally get hit hard and they realize, hey, it wasn't pleasant, but it was not the end of the world. I'm still standing. And the other guy doesn't have anything else to hit me with. I think that the Russians are basically going to realize, we don't need the Europeans. We don't need the Americans. And I disagree with you in you're thinking that come the autumn or perhaps next year, a lot of these foreign firms will try to weasel their way back into Russia, into the Russian markets, into relationships with Russian firms and whatnot. I do not believe that. Or let me phrase it. I think that they will try, but I think that they will find a very, very closed door, because the Russians are not going to forget this. No way are they going to forget this, because this was really trying to break the Russians' will by any means necessary. And I think that this kind of damage, which was inflicted on the Russian economy, but is not fatal, I think that it builds up antibodies. And I don't think that the American companies or the European companies will be welcomed back. And if they are welcomed back, it will be with such stringent conditions and enormous taxes and tariffs and fees, and call them what you will, but there will be a concerted effort by Russia as a state to extract the maximum profit from these foreign companies, that many of them will decide, it might not be worth it. Many of them will try and thinking that maybe in a few years this will be sorted out, but I don't think it's ever going to be sorted out. And I think that this was a true chopping of that umbilical cord between Russia and Europe and the West. I think that this is far more traumatic than people have realized. and that for the Russians, the consensus will be in Russia that this is it. We tried our best with the West, but they don't want us. They hate us. And the Chinese and the Indians love us. So why are we messing with these people who are, and this is the point of view of the Russians, and frankly, I agree with it. They're going to say the Europeans are decadent, degenerate, a dying people who are allowing themselves to be invaded. What do we need to do with these people? Nothing. We can go there on holidays, but we don't need to do business with them or be associated with them because they hate us. Whereas the Chinese love us, the Indians love us. So let's just pivot in that direction. I truly think that this is psychologically for the Russian people, not just the leadership classes, but all Russians. This has been a traumatic experience. They're going to win the war, by the way. There's no question about that. But the relationship with the West, it's irretrievably broken. It will never, never go back to the status quo ante. Never. And the Russians will always view the West with contempt.
Yeah.
That's my subjective appraisal. And I'm sure that a lot of people would disagree with this. Only time will tell. But you see, if a whole society, a whole civilization rejects you and demonizes you, and before the broadcast, we were talking about musicians, Russian musicians who were being persecuted and demonized. I mean, come on, Russian musicians. I mean, if they're musicians, they mean no one any harm, and they're being persecuted very much like Jews in the 1930s in Germany. It's absurd, and so I think that the Russians will never forget this, and they will carry this resentment. And what's the best way to resolve a resentment? There are two ways. You can either attack the people that you resent, or you can ignore them and turn away. And I think that that's the path that the Russians are going to take.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think they went too far. They went after the media, the censorship, going after people on a personal level. They took it way, way too far. Yeah.
I mean, come on, like some conductor who gets kicked out of his job because he's Russian. There's some piano prodigy, some 20-year-old kid, right? I mean, he's not involved in politics. He's playing piano all day, for crying out loud, right? He's on the one hand, he's a nobody. I mean, very successful young musician and good for him. I actually don't know his name. I just read about the headline of it, that his tour was being canceled. And he's a 20-year-old boy who never harmed anybody. He's been playing piano all of his life, and he's being ostracized because he's Russian. That's just stupid. That's a way you make enemies who will never forget. That's the thing, because people's memory are long. This is a disaster. It's a disaster for our civilization as a whole, because whether the Europeans or the Americans like it or not, Russia is a great European civilization. Russia has contributed to the West in immeasurable ways, in terms of music, in terms of art, in terms of architecture, and let's not even talk about literature. The greatest novelists ever were three: Dickens, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky, and not in that order. We all know that the big T was the real guy there, okay? Followed by the big D, right? They have contributed enormously to our culture, our civilization, and to marginalize it in such a petty way, it's unconscionable, and it's shocking, quite frankly. As far as I'm concerned, I've always admired Russian culture. I studied Russian history in university. I find it just shocking that it's being demonized this way, in such a petty and low way, by the leadership class in the West. I don't think that I've ever seen that. I mean, I don't even think that in the Second World War, I don't think that they demonized German culture the way that Russian culture is being demonized now. And the West isn't even at war with Russia, for crying out loud. Hello?
This is completely true, and obviously, I mean, I know some. I'm not vast numbers of Russian friends, but I have some, and I know that they were profoundly shocked by this, even some of them who have been critical of the Putin government up to now,
Yeah.
and critical for all kinds of reasons. But I mean, but it comes back to the point that Alex was making. There's an almost visceral outburst. One feels that this sort of welling anger and loathing has existed there for a long time, and it's been building up and it's been simmering under the surface, and suddenly it's now burst out into the open, and it's striking at every level. And I absolutely agree. I don't think the Russians will ever forget this. I think that this is something that immediately they have noticed. And by the way, there was one thing, in my opinion, which hit home most immediately of all of the other things, and that was the closure of European airspace, basically to flights from Russia. I mean, from Aeroflot, because that basically was telling Russians, you're not wanted here.
We don't want you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Yeah. Oh. Gonzalo, Alexander, false flag. Are you guys worried?
Yes, extremely worried. I will genuinely say that I do believe that the Americans and the Ukrainians are planning a false flag, and I am extraordinarily worried. I think that they have planted the notion that the Russians are losing this conflict, so that they can say, "See, they're losing, and that's why they did this false flag," and use this false flag as a justification for NATO involvement in this conflict. And I think that the signs are all there. They're talking about it openly, that the Russians are going to do a false flag, which doesn't make any sense if you're winning. But of course, if you've told your own people that the Russians are losing, then it makes complete sense. I'm deeply, deeply afraid of this, because there are several different segments within the American establishment that want a war very badly. There are the neocons who, for reasons of their own, of McCainian impotence, let's call it that, because that's what it really is, from John McCain, his impotence at being emasculated by the Vietnamese. He never got over that, and he's always hated the Russians for it. And then there's the issue of the Biden administration that wants to deflect from its responsibility for its mismanagement of the American economy, and therefore, blame it all on Putin. There is a segment of the neoliberal economic establishment headed by Paul Krugman, who he's a man whom I despise. I've had a couple of run-ins with him back when I was writing about finance. He honestly and truly believes that a war, a global war, a world war, is the way to solve America's economic problems. I wish I were kidding, but that's what the man actually thinks. He's said so multiple times. And he's advocated openly for war with Iran and other countries as a way to kickstart the American economy and get it out of the doldrums that people like he himself caused by the deindustrialization of the United States. And those are just 3-4 groups that I'm mentioning. There are other groups, Mitt Romney and the whole Raytheon industrial military complex, who want war so that they can sell more equipment and get more money. All kinds of different groups in the United States want a war with Russia. And so my terror is that they'll get their way, and that people like Victoria Nuland, Wendy Sherman, Anthony Blinken, who have a deep and abiding ethno-religious hatred for Russia, because that's the only way that you can characterize their animus towards Russia. Well, they will do anything to cause the conditions whereby NATO goes to war with Russia. And that's why I believe that there's going to be a false flag. And that's why this Russian strike on the training center outside of Lviv, I think, was so important, because I think that the only people who might be rational at this moment is and I can't believe I'm saying this, is the US Pentagon. Because I think that they're the only people realizing that, no, we don't want to get involved with the Russians, because it will get bad for us. It will get really bad for us. So let's just steer clear of this whole mess. I think that that's what the Pentagon is thinking. And let us hope that they have the political muscle, whatever is necessary, to prevent the United States from carrying out some grotesque false flag that will only hurt Ukrainian people and will potentially widen this conflict in ways that are completely unpredictable and might wind up in the most horrifying outcome. Yeah. Sorry for ranting like this, but it's something that I truly worry about.
Alexander.
I share your worry completely, Gonzalo, because of course these people in Washington and elsewhere, and in Ukraine, of course, itself, are playing for the very highest stakes, and they have no reverse gear. I mean, about people wanting to continue the war, just to say this, and even escalate it. I mean, this is from Responsible Statecraft, which is the website of the Quincy Institute, and it says this, and this comes from within the U.S. Foreign policy establishment. It's a more realist wing, and it's critical of the policy, but it says many in the administration seem to actively wish to continue the war as long as is necessary to inflict an unconditional defeat on Putin or even bring him down. And then there's a reference to a quote from Victoria Nuland. And there's talk about anonymous reports from administration officials who want the war to continue for a decade or more in order to guarantee that Russia will lose. Now, of course, if that's your plan, if you really think that you're going to bog the Russians down, by the way, this talk about bogging the Russians down has been
stupid.
I mean, they talked about that in Syria. They talked about it in Afghanistan, by the way, and they had some success there. But in the end, they themselves got themselves bogged down. We must never forget that. But all this talk, if of course, on the contrary, it looks as if the Russians are not going to get bogged down. If, on the contrary, they are going to win, when you set yourself these enormous objectives, bring down Putin, crash Russia, do all these kind of things, if that's not going to work, and if you're going to find yourself the loser, well, what do you do? And the pressure to double down and to intensify and to escalate in some way from these kind of people. I'm not saying everybody in Washington thinks like that. The Pentagon, I'm sure, doesn't. But these sort of people is going to intensify and grow. And of course, when people start to look for means to escalate, well, all sorts of dangerous plans like the kinds we've been talking about start to, float up to the surface. So I'm afraid I think this danger is extremely real. And of course, it's also extremely real in terms of Ukraine, because if they feel they're going to lose, which they are losing, if it looks as if things are going to go terribly badly for them, well, what do? Their entire strategy, as far as I can see, has been to try to get NATO directly involved in the war. And we've had all kinds of strange things like sending obsolescent Soviet drones flying into, was it Bulgaria or Croatia? I can't remember.
Croatia.
Croatia.
That was the
bizarre things, but all these odd things like this have been happening. So again, from their point of view, you can see that they have a compelling motive to want something like that, some big event that they can package and sell to the Western public as requiring an urgent intervention to bring this thing to an end, when in fact, of course, it's not going to bring it to an end. It's simply going to escalate it. So, I mean, the line between disaster and, not disaster is very narrow. And it ultimately depends on some rational people in the Department of Defense in Washington. I suspect some rational people in the Federal Reserve Board and the Treasury and Commerce departments, though there are also some very hardline people within the Treasury. But, when things are as precarious as that, you cannot be at all confident that things can always go hideously and disastrously wrong at any time.
Yeah, because, like, for instance, I can speak with some knowledge of the current situation in Ukraine here on the ground. And what is increasingly clear is that the isolated patches of the Zelensky regime's forces, they're spread out. They are not able to work together to do any kind of, I mean, forget about counteroffensive, just to defend themselves. They're isolated. The Russians have successfully isolated these various pockets. And over the next 2 weeks to 6 weeks, it's just going to be an issue of slowly squeezing them closed. And there's going to be a lot of damage because the Zelensky regime, I think that they fundamentally recognize, not Zelensky himself, because he has always been a puppet, first of Kolomoisky, the oligarch, and now it seems increasingly clear that he is held hostage by his own security people of the various extremist groups that have coalesced around the Zelensky regime. Let's leave it at that. But we all know who we're talking about, and we can't say it for the audience to understand, because if we do, we get into trouble with YouTube and whatnot. And so we won't go into the specific groups, but we all know who we're talking about. And these groups essentially have Zelensky hostage. And so they're going to fight to the death, because the Russians have made it very, very clear that insofar as the regular army, the regular Ukrainian army, they're going to welcome them with open arms at the end of this conflict. But those extremist groups are going to be prosecuted, and the Russians are not going to show any kind of mercy towards them. And so, especially in Mariupol, where you have these battalions there, they know that this is a fight to the death. And you're seeing what's happening in Mariupol, that they have no trouble whatsoever of absolutely destroying the entire city and putting civilian lives at great risk, using them literally as human shields in order to keep the Russians at bay. But see, they can't win. And so all that they will do is hurt Ukraine, kill Ukrainian civilians needlessly, and also soldiers needlessly. And these young men, they're the flower of any country. You don't want to lose them, because they are the young men today who will be the adults, the leaders of tomorrow. And you don't want them to suffer needlessly, to die needlessly. But I think that the criminal Zelensky regime will do so. And I have to tell the listeners, your listeners, excuse me, I have to tell your listeners that I personally have felt victimized by this Zelensky regime. And so my appreciation of it is rather emotional, because I truly believe that they are just gangsters, thieves, murderers, liars, the worst sorts of people. And I have seen that up close and personal. I mean, do keep in mind, they assassinated one of their own negotiators on the suspicion that maybe he was helping the Russians in some way or other. They assassinated him. They have assassinated mayors. They have kidnapped and tortured members of the Ukrainian parliament. They have kidnapped and tortured famous mixed martial arts fighters merely for training with Russians. They're animals, as far as I'm concerned. And these animals, unfortunately, seem to have taken control of the Ukrainian government. They control Zelensky, the puppet, and they will fight to the last Ukrainian to save their hides, because the Russians know who they are and have no bones about their objective, which is to, basically grab them and string them up from the nearest lamppost. And I, for one, completely agree with that, because I do believe that these people are animals who care nothing about Ukraine as a nation, the Ukrainian infrastructure, or much less the Ukrainian people. And sorry for getting a little bit emotional about this particular issue, but I'm very, very adamant about how much I despise these people who are currently in control of the Zelensky regime and who are just nefarious and horrible. Yeah, sorry about that. Sorry, gentlemen. I'm getting out of sorts on this particular issue.
No, I mean, we have to say that you are on the ground in Kharkiv, and you've been
Absolutely.
for a while stuck in this conflict. So,
Oh, I don't mind being in the conflict. That doesn't bother me. I mean, it's not fun. I'd prefer to be in Tahiti, if we're being honest, right? But well, actually, no, I'm more of a snow guy. So if you could send me to Zermatt, I'd be happier there. But No, that's not the problem. The problem for me is how that they have carried out political kidnappings and political assassinations during this conflict. And you would think that it's the last thing on their minds to be worrying about political score settling in when your country is being invaded. I mean, you know, the Russians are calling it a special operations. It's an invasion. Let's call a spade a spade. But they are more concerned about settling political scores and intimidating people for pointing out the truth than for protecting their own country. And so I find them despicable. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I'm afraid I am going to have to.
Yeah, we have to wrap it up. We have to wrap it up. Any final thoughts, guys? Alexander, Gonzalo?
Well, I think we've covered an enormous amount of ground, and we've said very, very much. There's some, by the way, uncorroborated reports that the Chinese foreign minister is heading to Moscow tomorrow. We'll see whether that's true. Absolutely, which is, you know, probably a sign, you know, to indicate support and have a brief, you know, public briefings with the Russian leadership. So the Chinese are clearly, but, you know, I want to stress these are just reports. We haven't yet had any official confirmation from anybody. So we'll see what happens. We will see what comes.
Yeah. My final note would be keep your eye on India, China. I think that if that pivot happens because of this crisis, it will be a realignment of the entire globe. It's subtle, but it will be crucial. Yeah.
I agree.
And once again, gentlemen, thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Stay safe, and we look forward to having you on again very, very soon. Thank you to everyone that watched us on Odyssey, on Rumble, on YouTube, and on Locals, our amazing Locals community, the Duran.locals.com. If anything happens with us and with our content, the first place to go to is the Duran.locals.com. And thank you to our moderators. Thank you very, very much to our moderators. And to everyone that sent a question, whether it was on Rumble, on Odyssey, or on YouTube, as well as in the Locals chat. I will gather up all those questions, and Alexander will go through them and get them up tomorrow. We'll get answers to all those questions tomorrow. Yeah. So we'll have a really good Q&A video set up tomorrow as well. Gonzalo, stay safe. Stay safe.
Absolutely.
And let's have you on again really soon. You have an open invitation whenever you want.
Thank you so much.
To come on. Alexander, thank you very much. Take care, everybody.